Hello everyone, it's your boy, Gabriel, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Since I done my TNF The Railway Series Complete Collection video, I'm gonna talk about real steam locomotives, not in the UK, but in the US. So sit back, relax, and let me read to you. In the 21st century, mainline steam excursions are considered by some to be one of the best public relationships to any major railroad. Dozens of private crews have restored the engines used on these to running condition out of respect for the past and an eye to educate future generations. Sadly though, not all the steam locomotives that ran excursions today. Some were retired for various reasons, some were replaced by dieselization, or, in the worst case, outright scrapped. However, some engines were running excursions today, or they might not. Some of them will experience a return to glory very soon. But without further ado, here is my list of the top 15 retired steam excursion stars. Number 15, Grand Trunk Western number 4070. This 1918 Alco-built Mikado was originally built as engine number 3734, but renumbered to number 4070 in the 1950s. Its last revenue freight assignment for the GTW occurred on March 29, 1960, 2 days after the railway had made the complete transition to diesels. After sitting idle in Michigan for 6 years, the 4070 was leased by the Midwest Railway Preservation Society for excursions. From 1966 to 1974, the locomotive ran several trips on former Grand Trunk trackage and through Pennsylvania with a Reading 484 engine number 2102. In the beginning of 1975, locomotive number 4070 ran a weekend excursion on the new Cayuga Valley line between Cleveland and Akron. After nearly 40 years of excursion service, the Husky Mikado was retired in 1990 after mechanical problems sidelined her. Today, the locomotive resides at the Midwest Railway Preservation Society's former B&O Roundhouse in the flats of Cleveland. In 2014, railway repairmen are beginning to restore the locomotive to service, but it'll take a few years before she will be ready to run again. Number 14, Grand Trunk Western number 5629. Another Grand Trunk Western engine, this 462 Pacific was brought by Richard J. Jensen, an American historian, in 1959. The 1924 Alco product was later used on a few excursions on the Chicago area in the late 1960s, as well as having a 2-year event pulling the Schlitz Circus train from Baraboo to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. However, Jensen ran into financial trouble in the early 1970s and couldn't afford to run more excursions with the engine. He moved number 5629 around until he was able to come to an agreement with the Rock Island Railway to store the engine to the Blue Island, Illinois freight yard. After the Rock Island Railway was abandoned, Metra acquired the Blue Island complex in the hopes of redesigning the property. Even though Metra was allowed to use the Blue Island complex, they couldn't move 5629 since it was owned by Jensen. Metra offered Jensen to move the locomotive to the Iowa Interstate Railroad, but won't provide any assistance to getting it there. After several groups, including the Illinois Railway Museum, tried to get their hands on the engine and move it without Jensen's approval. Soon after, Metra had had enough. They sent out a salvage crew and scrapped the engine right where it stood. All railfans could do is watch with horror and disbelief as the once preserved engine was cut up. Luckily, there are 2 other Grand Trunk Western Pacifics left, so 5629's class lives on today. Number 13, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, number 5632. The CB&Q was one of the few railways in the 1950s that had a corporate steam excursion program. They had 2 locomotives that were their breadwinners, 282 number 4960 and 484 number 5632. The 5632 was one of the 05B class Northerns built at the Quincy's West Burlington, Iowa shops. For nearly 20 years, the engines moved freight and passenger trains over the CB&Q until the diesels began to replace them. Locomotive 5632 was spared from the scrapper's torch and saved by Harry C. Murphy for public excursion service. The 484 engine made a beautiful sight as he muscled huge excursion services solo and ran a double header with number 4960. During the 100th anniversary in 1964 of the opening of the Quincy's main line between Chicago and Aurora, Illinois, number 5632 had its title as the world's largest brass model and was painted gold to commemorate the occasion. But sadly, the CB&Q steam program won't last any longer. Harry Murphy was retired as president in 1966 and Louis W. Menck succeeded him. Louis Menck had no interest in running steam, and so he ends the program. Number 5632 was then sold to Richard Jensen along with a boxcar full of spare parts. The locomotive was moved in 1969 from the Chicago Indiana Railroad roundhouse that Jensen leased for years to a Chicago scrapyard for storage. Unfortunately, the engine derails as it traversed the trackage into the yard. With no way of getting the locomotive back on the track, the scrappers just cut up 5632 where he stood. The same fate that Grand Trunk Western number 5629 nearly a quarter of a century later. But just like the CTW engine, 5632 has 4 brother engines that carry on his legacy. And what about number 4960? Well, he's still running trips today on selected Saturdays throughout the year at the famed Grand Canyon Railway in Williams, Arizona. Number 12, Nickel Plate Road 759. This powerful 284 locomotive was built in 1944 by the Lima Locomotive Works for passenger and freight services on the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad, often shortened by the Nickel Plate Road. This locomotive, along with all of her sisters, retired in June 1958. In 1962, the locomotive was purchased by F. Nelson Blount for his Steamtown, USA collection, and to North Walpole, New Hampshire. It would be moved once more to Bellows Falls, Vermont. In 1967, Ross Rowland made a deal with Blount to restore 759 to service for some steam-powered excursion services hosted by his High Iron Company, and soon the engine was restored and running again in a nickel plate roundhouse in Conneaut, Ohio. On August 30, 1968, the locomotive ran its first excursion to Buffalo, New York. The engine was extremely popular during his career, pulling many excursion services before Amtrak took over all passenger services. After a few excursions in late 1973, 759 was placed in storage at the Delaware Hudson's Roundhouse in Rouse's Point, New York. However, the locomotive's boiler was having some serious trouble, and all remaining water in it froze, causing severe damage to many boiler fluids. After that, the DNA made some repairs to the locomotive, and 759 was test-fired in 1975. After a fluid failed during hydrostatic test in 1977, it was then decided that the engine will remain as a static display. Today, the locomotive is on display at the Steamtown National Historic Site in Scranton, Pennsylvania, now owned by the National Park Service. Number 11, Cotton Belt number 819. The St. Louis Southwestern Railroad, better known as the Cotton Belt, had some home-built 484 Northerns in the exact way the CB&Q had. Engine number 819 was built in 1942 at the Pine Bluff, Arkansas shop and entered revenue freight service in February 1943. The Cotton Belt 484s became the prime movers for freight trains on the main line and were the preferred engines of choice for the railway's Blue Streak merchandise trains from Missouri to Texas, and were interchanged with their parent company, Southern Pacific. After a brief 10-year career on the Cotton Belt, the locomotive was retired in 1955 and was placed in a park in Pine Bluff. After nearly 30 years of being exposed to the elements and vandals, the engine looked like a shell of its former self. But in 1983, salvation came from the form of the Cotton Belt Rail Historical Society. They teamed up and moved the 819 out of the park and back to the Pine Bluff shops where she was built for restoration. After 3 years of work, the engine was steamed up again in April of 1986 and began running excursions on the Cotton Belt Railroad throughout Arkansas and Texas. In 1990, the locomotive had undertook its longest trip when it traveled to St. Louis, Missouri for the National Railway Society Convention. And on October 1993, her last excursion ran from Pine Bluff to Tyler, Texas and back. From that point on, 819 was stored at the Pine Bluff shop, now home to the Arkansas Railroad Museum. Restoring the engine to work again has been proceeding with fits and starts, but a new initiative called Project 819 is currently raising funds to invest a boiler ultrasound test. Once the results are known, the volunteers will continue the necessary work to bring the pride of Pine Bluff back to work. That's all for now, folks. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for part 2. Bye!